are good. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our eLotus webinar today. My name is Donna Chow, and I will be your host and your moderator for today's class. Here at Lotus Institute of Integrative Medicine, we are the leading CEU provider for acupuncturists, providing the largest selection of online courses. So if you are here looking to learn something useful that you're able to apply in your clinic right away, you have come to the right place. We are dedicated to the preservation of TCM wisdom here. And so we thank you for joining us in our mission. Today's webinar will run from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. We'll have a 1-hour lunch break about 1 to 2 p.m. 2 short breaks in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. And so let's go ahead and give a tour for anyone who's new to the webinars, what you are seeing on your screen right now. On the top left-hand corner is the video feed. And to the right of the video feed is the PowerPoint for today's class. There are lecture notes currently available for download, and you can find them on the Blue Course Access page. On the bottom, you'll find two boxes. The first box to your left is the chat room, and to the right of the chat room is information that you'll find important for today's class, as well as upcoming events. So back to the chat room. If you see someone from school or someone that you want to chat with privately, you can do so by clicking on the menu button at the top right-hand corner of the chat room. Once you click on that, you will see Start Private Chat With, and you can select whoever you like. And the Adobe interface allows only one login per user, so if you're logged in more than once, you will hear an echoing sound. To resolve that issue, just close the extra window, or after a period of time, Adobe does help remove the extra login for you. If you experience any technical issues such as slowing, skipping, or stopping, you can press F5 and that will refresh your screen, or you can close and restart your webinar window. If all else fails, please go ahead and private chat with our tech, Sam or I, and we will be glad to help you. Okay, so let's get started with the class. Today's class is the art of herbal preparation, powders, pills, ointments, and plasters with Lorraine Wilcox, who is the author of 2 books on moxibustion and the translator of a number of Ming Dynasty medical books. She has been licensed in California since 1989. Wilcox reads medical Chinese and likes to mine the old books for techniques and treatments that can be brought into the modern clinic. Whether it is moxibustion or herbal preparations, Wilcox often turns her kitchen into a lab and works out the way these things were prepared and used in the past. And so today, this room will be her kitchen, and you guys will be the audience to watch her. So I hope you enjoy the class. Let's go ahead and give a big warm welcome to Lorraine.
Thank you. A wait signal. So hi, humans. Here we are, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I like playing with herbs. So what I do often is experiment with recipes the way they were originally made and try to figure out how to make them in the original way. So I'm going to go through the slideshow. We're going to make this morning a couple of things for internal use, and this afternoon a couple of things for external use, and that's basically what we're going to do. I'm sure a lot of you use the little tea pills that you can buy, or the powdered extracts that you can mix, the modern type of extracts. Some of you may use decoctions, but it's been my observation that most practitioners don't do a lot of other types of preparations, and I think these are really very useful clinically, although they may take a little getting used to, and so we're going to explore some of these other methods of preparing herbs. Besides that, in this class, I'm going to add a few case studies from the Ming Dynasty that illustrate the use of some of these herbs. So yeah, we're going to talk about internal use today, and the first thing is, why do we need different formulations? So there's a Ming Dynasty book, you can see the details here, and it tells us that every type of herbal preparation has something specific that it's good for. So pills, powders, decoctions, and ointments have different uses, and the author, Dr. Miao, says that You can't just ignore the original way they were supposed to be prepared because it will affect the efficacy of the formula. Some things are better for pills and others for powders. Some things are better for decocting. Some are better for putting in, liquor or alcohol formulations. Some need to be made into ointments, and some things have multiple ways they can be used. And some things have ways that they shouldn't be used. He says you can't violate the nature of the herb and what the herb is good for. There's a pretty interesting thing in the little 1-hour intro. I had a shorter version of it that comes from Bunsao Gangmu, but here's from this same book about herbal processing, and it has a little more detail than the other quote. It says decoctions mean to wash away, but there's some wordplay here because in Chinese it's like tang means dang, it rhymes, and there's, something that a Chinese person would recognize. Also, if you look at the characters for those two, the second character is basically like the first character. It's really both a visual play on words as well as a rhyming play on words. And so decoctions mean to wash away, and he explains this means boiling herbs in a clear liquid like water, although sometimes other things are used. And then he says decoctions are good for serious disease. So, if somebody's really sick, maybe a decoction is your best method of treating. Powder means to scatter. And here's something that in Chinese, the same word that means to scatter with a slightly different pronunciation, the same character means powder. So when we hear of like Xiaoyao san or those kinds of san formulas, this word both means powder and scattering. So if you notice, most of the san formulas are really for excess conditions to disperse something that's accumulated. He says grinding herbs into a fine powder and use powders to remove acute diseases. I'll talk more about that later. I'm going to talk about powders a lot today. A paste or an ointment or a plaster is the word gao, and that means to stew for a long time. So in Chinese it's gao means ao. It rhymes once again, and so it's making some thick kind of viscous liquid formulation. There's also another type where he doesn't do any rhyming or wordplay. Liquids are basically squeezing out the juice from fresh herbs. Pills means slow, and in Chinese, wan means huan. It rhymes once again. Pills are these round pellets, and they're not quick at treating, but they're more slow and gentle, which means that you can use them for chronic, long-term diseases or more mild diseases. So remember, he says you shouldn't violate the formulation. You should use the appropriate one and not just decoct everything, or not just automatically use the modern extracts, for example. He says, he goes on about powders. Fine powders don't follow the jingwo, the channels in the network vessels. So if you have a channel problem, you probably don't want to use powders. He says they remove accumulations from the stomach and the organs. Accumulations, because remember, powders scatter. So if you have an accumulation, then you want to scatter it, break it apart. So they're also appropriate for treating lung disease such as cough. Why? We'll see in a little while. Powders tend to be light, so they float upward. They're really good at treating the upper jiao. And he goes on, like there are actually two main ways of doing powders. One is for powders with like really rich flavors, then you just mix it with hot water and strain it out. He doesn't say that here, but we'll see in a few minutes. But if the flavors are very mild and light, then you actually were supposed to swallow the powder along with it. I'm not big on that, but that's what he says. Pills, he goes on to talk about. remove diseases of the lower body. Why? Because they're heavy, so they move downward. Powders are light, so they float upward. And so, if they're really big, then they're especially going to go to the lower jiao. If they're medium size, they might treat the middle jiao. But if you want pills to treat the upper jiao, you have to make them very, very tiny, so that they don't sink below the place that you want them to go. And he also goes on, you can make water pills, you can make flour pills. So flour pills digest more slowly, and therefore they're also going to go lower. If you make it with alcohol or vinegar as the liquid to bind the pills together, then they'll help pull things inward. You can read the bansha stuff yourself, mix it with ginger juice. But honey pills are selected because they also digest slowly, but he says their qi does follow the channel. So if you have some channel problem, maybe you want to make honey pills and not use powders. Wax pills, I don't know. But they will be very slow in taking effect because the wax is much harder to digest. We probably don't use this much today. If you look in the old books, wax pills often had maybe some of the more toxic ingredients that we're not so likely to use today, and that made them slowly absorbed, kind of like time-lapse thing. So that's a little introduction. We can see then that in the Ming Dynasty, which was, 15th century, something like that, doctors felt that it's not just the herbs that make the treatment, but also the form that you process the herbs into can also have a strong effect. It's not just a matter of convenience, but they can actually influence the treatment. So let's talk about powders a little bit more. Some of this does repeat from the 1 hour introduction, but not a huge amount. So if you saw that, we'll get to new stuff really soon. For external use, powders can be used externally or internally. For external use, they were often, if you had a big wound that was open, you would sprinkle a dry powder into it to promote healing. You don't need a moistened powder because the open wound or the sore that was a little moist would provide the moisture to make the powder absorb. They also were blown through a straw into the nose or throat if someone had like a pus visible in the throat or something like that. They were used to open the orifices of an unconscious patient, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the last part of this class, just before the end. Perhaps today we're going to be calling 911 instead, and we're going to be doing, Western methods of emergency care if you have an unconscious patient, but it's still pretty interesting. The old books say that kind of the goal where you'll be successful is if you blow the powder in and you can make the patient sneeze, then he'll come back to life. That's a nice little detail. I've never done this. I haven't played with eye drops, but if you grind them really fine and they're the appropriate herbs, they could be made into eye drops. We will this afternoon, though, mix them with liquids to make plaster. We'll make a plaster, we'll make an ointment. For internal use, which is more our topic for this morning, I haven't seen this in the old books, but some people just swallow a spoonful of the powder and then drink something to wash it down. More often, you either pour hot water on the powder or you simmer it for a little while, and then you may or may not strain it, and then you drink the liquid. And then powders are also one step in pill making, which is something else we'll use them for this morning, or possibly some other formulations. So we have to grind herbs, or you have to buy herbs that are already ground. If you want a fine powder, then you need to sift. If you want a coarse powder, then you don't have to sift. So let's talk about powdering herbs. A long time ago, I would either I live in an area where you can go to a Chinese herb store, and I would ask them to grind it, and they charge a little extra fee. Fine. Eventually, I decided I want my own herb grinder. You can't just use a coffee grinder for some herbs. Some herbs you can, but a lot of herbs are too hard for a coffee grinder. So eventually, I bought a professional herb grinder, the manual, the English is pretty funny, but it works really good on grinding even very hard herbs. So if you're serious about this, eventually you might want to buy an herb grinder. The old way of doing it was this, like, sometimes it was called an iron boat, and you'd actually put the herbs in, and then I guess they'd sit in a stool and with their feet roll the, heavy weight back and forth to crush the herbs and grind it. And then on the table in the picture on the right, you can see a sieve that he's going to sift it with. And he does happen to be smoking his pipe while he's doing the work. So yeah, I like electricity. So while I like to experiment with the old formulations, I still am okay with having some modern equipment. So basically, for most powders, you put the formula together, and then you put the whole formula into the grinder, or at least as much as the capacity of that grinder. You may need to do it in a couple batches if the formula is bigger than what your grinder holds, but that helps to mix everything together so that it's well mixed. You generally don't grind the parts one by one, then if you want a fine grind, you get a calibrated sieve. They often come with the grinder when you buy it, but you can also buy them. It needs to be really fine because you want the powder to come out with the texture of like white flour, really light and fine. And so to use it, what you generally do, or at least what I've seen people do and what I do, is you pour the powder out of the grinder into the sieve over a bowl, and then you have a brush and you just move the powder back and forth and it comes through, and whatever stays in the sieve you can regrind and keep getting more. Usually there's a little at the end that you either have to throw away or just put it in with the herbs anyway, but I usually regrind a couple of times trying to get the maximum. There is a problem if resins are in it, like Rushang Mo Yao, Shui Jie, I don't pronounce well, but the dragon's blood kind of thing. And the problem is that if you just throw them in the grinder, they're just going to get gummy and stick to the grinder, and you can't clean it. And if you have one that's the motor's not very strong, it might even kind of make it work too hard and blow the motor. So these are really a problem. One solution is, even if you grind all the other herbs, you could order these powdered, and then you don't have to worry about grinding. But basically, maybe there's an easier way, but the way I've worked out is first, put them in a bag and then like bang them with a hammer into small pieces. And one of the things is that heat tends to melt resins, and so the grinder does get a little warm, and you really don't want it to get liquidy, you just want it to get powdery. So first I grind all the rest of the powder, and then I put the ground powder and the resin in the freezer for a while, and then when both are cold, then I use a large amount of powder and a small amount of the resin, and I grind it, and then I might put it in the freezer again, and so forth, and that way it will grind into a powder. It's really a pain. So you just have to decide if your recipe calls for that, if you want to buy it pre-ground and pay a little extra money, or if you want to excuse me, or if you want to go through the extra trouble. But eventually you can finish grinding, and you have a nice light powder that you can use as a san to drink, or you could use it to make pills or other kinds of things, ointments and so forth. One trick that I've learned is that to clean the grinder afterwards, some herbs are greasy and some herbs are sticky and so forth. You can put some white rice in the grinder and just grind it and then throw the white rice powder away, but it really does like clean out anything that's stuck on the inside. That seems to be the easiest way. Then of course you could wipe it out or whatever. So that's like a little introduction about dealing with, you know, how do you get the powder and why do we need different formulations. I'm going to start talking about pills, which you need a powder, generally speaking, to make pills. So we will take questions later, but I think I'm going to keep going for a while. We're going to make in class a pill that's called Sangma 1. You may not have heard of it. It's not a state board formula. It's not on the national board list, but it's a great one to start with if you want to make honey pills for a couple of reasons. One, doesn't have many ingredients, is pretty simple. Two, the herbs that are in it are easy to grind even in like a spice grinder or a home coffee grinder. They're not hard. And three, it really tastes pretty good. It almost, I know people who just like want to eat it, and I say, wait, that's medicine, don't just keep eating it. But you know, it almost tastes like candy because, you know, black sesame and honey, what can go wrong? So the first thing I tend to do is look for the original source. And in the original source, they actually called it by a different name, Fusang, Fusang 1, and you know, we don't care. But the original author, it's from a Qing Dynasty book, the original author says that it came from a foreign monk. So who is a foreign monk? Maybe from India, don't know. Buddhism was going back and forth, and so he got it from some foreign monk. And so he says it eliminates wind damp, which you know usually refers to some kind of bee pattern. It builds up the weak and the lame, so it's supplementing. It preserves the complexion. It blackens the mustache and head hair. It eliminates disease and lengthens lifespan. So it's kind of interesting, a combination of for bee patterns, but also very supplementing and maybe some cosmetic value. The ingredients are basically sangye, mulberry leaves, which, you know, if you have mulberry trees growing, if it's the right kind of mulberry tree, you could harvest the leaves yourself. And black sesame, which you can get in any Asian foods market. And then honey are the ingredients. So he has some very complicated way of making it, and while usually I like the old ways, later people just said, that's too much work, let's do it a simpler way, so we're going to do it a simpler way. You could read the more complicated way if you want. But then he goes on to talk about this formula, 3 ingredients, mulberry leaves, black sesame, and honey. He says these herbs go to the foot xiao yin and hand and foot yang ming channels. He says mulberry is so interesting in Chinese culture. Of course, you know it's what silkworms eat. And you also probably know that many different parts of it are used in herbal medicine. He says it's the essence of a certain constellation, that constellation is in the east, which is wood, but it's associated with water element. Mulberry wood helps the joints to be able to move freely and smoothly, and it nourishes fluids. And he points out something that you find in the old books. You know, of course, today we use a stove to cook herbs, but in ancient times they would have to cook herbs over some kind of fire, and it was always recommended, not for food necessarily, but for herbs, that you cook it over a fire of mulberry wood, and that was supposed to give the best quality of medicine. So you can say, oh, that was superstition, or you could say, that's pretty interesting. But most of us don't have the option of cooking our herbs on mulberry wood. Still, it has, very important relationship with medicine. The leaves are sweet and cold, the mulberry leaves, sweet and cold, and enter the hand and foot yang ming, so of course that's stomach and large intestine. The leaves cool the blood, dry dampness, and eliminate wind. But black sesame, on the other hand, is sweet and neutral in temperature. Of course, it's black in color, and so it's going to go to the kidneys, although it also helps out the liver. It's moistening, so it moistens the various organs. And he says it fills in jing. We all could use a little more of that, can't we? And marrow. He quotes another ancient doctor who is also very Taoist and experimental in Taoist cultivation. And Tao Hong Jing said that, at some point they talked about 8 different grains, but actually in Chinese the 8 grains include beans as well as rice and wheat and so forth, and sesame was one of them. Some of the ancient people thought that eliminating grains would promote not only long life, but even perhaps some supernatural Taoist powers, and he said the only grain that's good is black sesame. So, okay. The text goes on to say that when you get rid of wind and damp, the sinews and bones will get stronger, because remember, wind damp usually refers to a B pattern. And so if you get rid of the evils that are harassing the sinews and bones, then they're going to improve. And when they get full, then your complexion is bright. And so this pill prevents disease and blackens the mustache. Well, I don't really want a black mustache. Here's the modern recipe, same ingredients, simpler method, maybe a different proportion of the ingredients. So we have the mulberry leaf sangye, 80 grams, the black sesame seed hejima, 40 grams, half of the amount, and then it says honey 100 grams, but when we make it, which we will in a minute, really, you don't measure it and put it in. You have to judge the texture if you want to have good quality pills. So take that 100 grams of honey as an approximation, but I'm not even going to measure. I'm going to just hopefully get the right texture. So as I was saying, you can buy black sesame seed already. You can buy it in Asian markets, and even you can often buy it already ground up into a powder, so you don't even have to do any grinding. But if you want to grind it yourself, it's not so hard, so it won't damage your coffee grinder or your spice grinder if you don't have a professional one. The mulberry leaves, also leaves you could grind in anything. So this one, even if you don't have the grinder, it's good. And then if I'm going to be spending time and effort and money on making a pill myself, I want good quality. So while sure you can buy honey in the grocery store and you'll make pills that are just fine, but I go to the farmer's market and support the local bee people. So I have honey from the farmer's market. And so this is going on from modern sources. It says some similar stuff. This formula supplements liver and kidneys. It clears heat from the head and eyes, but in a very mild way, so you don't have to, worry about it being too cold. It gets rid of wind damp B patterns. It also treats yin deficiency. Black sesame moistens the liver and kidneys. Dryness of the blood, possibly with dizziness or blurry vision, chronic cough, dry skin, some type of constipation that's from dryness, not from heat, and numbness, because if it treats the liver, it treats the sinews, and if the sinews aren't nourished, then numbness is one possible consequence. It wants you to take 1 pill twice a day on an empty stomach. The pills are going to be bigger because you can chew honey pills. They're not like the little tea pills, really tiny. And just like the old instructions said, you can take it with salted water in the morning and with liquor in the evening. You can. I don't. Um, so it talks some more about the qualities of the herbs, and we've already talked about them, but it does say for Hadrima it prevents premature graying, and some other things. So so this is what we're going to do in just a minute, is we have the ingredients powdered already over there, and we want the powder, for making pills, you want the powder fairly fine because you don't want it to be all scratchy in your throat as you swallow it, or you don't want to feel little things between your teeth in your mouth. So to make the mouth texture appropriate, you really, really want a fine powder for the most part. The first time I tried making honey pills, I didn't understand that, and it was so disgusting. It wasn't this, it was actually a different formula. So the taste was disgusting, and the texture in the mouth was disgusting. But I've learned, at least, maybe you can't help the taste of the herbs, but you can make a better texture in your mouth if you use a fine grind. So you add a little bit of honey, but the deal is you don't want to overdo it. You want to add a little at a time, because if you add too much honey, it will be too sticky and make a mess and just be in your mouth, like, you know, the bad feeling of peanut butter in your mouth when it gets between your teeth. So you don't want to add too much honey. Better to start with just a little bit of honey, and you mix it in and then add a little more, and you mix it in and add a little more. And I really, in the beginning, the pills would be way too sticky when I'd get enough honey in that the dough felt good, but then once you roll it, they'd stick to each other and your hands would be so dirty. And eventually I found out from reading old texts that the secret to honey pills is using a mortar and pestle and pestling it. One of the old books says 100 times, pestling it 100 times. And if you do that, I think what happens is the honey kind of beads up, and it's coated with powder on the outside, but there's still little beads of honey in it. And even working it with your hands, it doesn't really break up those little beads, and so then when you start rolling it, it just becomes way too moist. But if you pestle it 100 times, it may seem too dry, but by the time you've pestled it that many times, then it really becomes moist and just the perfect texture for the dough. The dough should maybe be like bread dough when it's not too sticky, like with a little flour on the outside, so it's not too sticky. If you add too much honey, then you have to add more powder in, and then it just, you know, it's better to just slowly add the honey. So really the trick is pestling it. You can count to 100 if you're OCD. Sometimes I am. Or you could just really do it for, 5 minutes until the texture really seems to have changed. So yeah, here's my mortar and pestle. We'll do this in a minute. And if you make a large amount, you may have to pestle it in a couple batches in order to have room, unless you have a bigger mortar and pestle than I do. And you break off chunks and roll them into pills, just like this. We'll be doing this. And or another way is to like roll out little, snakes of it, and then break off pieces and roll into pills. This is, if it turns out like this, too much honey, not enough powder. Your hands should really be, they won't be perfectly clean. You can see the picture on the left. There's some, residue there, but it's not like this. This was before I learned, the secret. And so this means you added too much honey and you didn't pestle it. And so you can decide, at some times I've kind of coated the outside of the pill with a little more powder just to make it less sticky on the outside. Okay, so maybe we should do this, and then I'll come back and talk some more. Is that okay? Yeah? So. Would you mind kicking the trash can over here? Because I don't want my hands to be from the trash can, you know. Thank you. I appreciate that. Hi, how are you? David, right? Yeah. So, okay, I have a few other things that at some point I'll show you. Well, I could show you this now. These are honey pills I made a long time ago. I made them last year. And so these are, what would you say, the size of a medium or small grape, or the size of a marble or something like that. But since they're made out of honey, you don't have to swallow them, you chew them. These are a little dry because they were made a year ago, but honey is a natural preservative, so you don't really need to worry about them going bad. This is a different formula. This is Jiajian Baoiwan. And so, okay, so I pre-measured, and actually I'm going to make a half a recipe of what it said there, because a whole recipe takes a really long time to roll all those pills. And so I pre-measured. This is the black sesame seed. This is 20 grams. And we'll pour this in here. I will tell you, I never cook. I just experiment with like making herbs. So sometimes like there are better ways of doing things that I don't know, because I'm not like a kitchen person. This is the sangye, the mulberry powder. We're going to pour that into. And you know, this is like before I had my herb grinder, then I would buy it like powdered. So this is just mulberry powder, and you know, here's black sesame you can get from the grocery store if you have an Asian grocery store. I think this might be from a Japanese grocery store, but Chinese grocery stores have them. And so, you know, I'm going to mix the two powders first, so that I probably don't need to do that. It'll get plenty of mixing. And I have honey from the farmer's market. Now it gets sticky. Yeah. So I'm going to use a different spoon for getting honey out than I use for stirring and so forth. And we'll start with like, okay. And I also have like popsicle sticks to kind of okay. Yeah. Maybe we'll put that there. So I'm just gonna, this obviously won't, be enough honey. But just start doing it, and let's get a little bit more. So yeah, I don't cook, so if I'm fumbling, it's because like I'm not good at this stuff. I just experiment. I don't do this every day. Donna, if there are questions, I can talk while I do this. Is that okay?
Do you recommend storing your prepared pills and herbs in general in glass as opposed to plastic?
Yeah, it was in a plastic container, and it shouldn't be. You know, if you have options, don't use plastic. But sometimes I get sloppy. And or something airtight is good, because they will dry out. Honey pills don't go bad. I mean, if it looks like it's gone bad, don't take them. But honey is a natural preservative, so it's usually not a problem. Any other questions, or that's it? Okay, how about you guys? Questions?
So it's good to put the honey pills in the refrigerator, or
it depends. You know, if it's really hot summer and you don't have air conditioning, maybe you want to, just because you don't want them to melt. You know, heat makes the honey become more watery. Or maybe if you're not going to use them for a long time. Oh, the question was, do you want to put honey pills in the refrigerator? And I think it depends on the ambient temperature or how long you're not going to use them. These have been not in the refrigerator for all that time, a year. And yeah, they dried out. Probably a Ziploc would have been better, or a smaller glass container would have been better.
Because I got way you put in one formula and honey done in big pills, like 5 grams size pills, and they got moldy after.
Made with honey?
Yeah.
Really? So what kind of pills, what was in them?
Way you put in one formula.
I've never had that, but I don't make every type of pill. I've only made a few kinds of pills, so maybe certain herbs are more susceptible. But certainly if you think it got moldy, then throw it out. So sorry, this is taking more honey than I anticipated, so I'm going to keep doing this.
Who do you use as sources of pre-ground herbs?
You know, since I live in the Los Angeles area, sometimes I just go to an herb store and you know, if I find one that might grind them for me, but other times I've ordered from Mayway. You know, it's not like I think they're the only one, but it just happens to be who I have used. So you guys should know that I'm not currently treating patients and haven't for a while, so mostly I teach and I translate and I write, and so I'm not using a large volume of herbs, and therefore you know, I'm not as fussy about who I buy from as you might be if you were really concerned about price because you're using a lot of them. Anything else? Okay.
How many pills should one take? How do you measure the amount of herbs in each pill?
So one thing that we should know is that modern people are obsessed with the exact grams, and this tends to be myself included, but in ancient times, you know, like if you've ever gone to a pharmacy where there's a really experienced herbal pharmacist, they don't always weigh out things, they just know how much stuff weighs, and so it could be off by, you know, a gram or two. So I'm not overly fussy. I make the pills like you saw, about the size of a marble, and you're supposed to take one in the morning and one in the evening, and you could weigh it. I think in Bensky has this formula, and I think it does say how much each pill should weigh, but I don't want to sit around weighing each pill. So I eyeball it, and this is a mild formula. Of course, if you're using herbs that are more, you know, drastic, you might care more. But for something like, you know, mulberry leaves and black sesame, I don't think we need to worry too much. So I'm going to put my hands in, because it's at the point where, and I hope I didn't do too much honey. I might have done too much honey. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just mixing it together, and ooh, I need a favor. Would you move the mortar and pestle to the center? Because I'm so sticky right now, and this is too much. I should probably add a little more powder. So yeah, it's always an experiment. Because it tastes better, let's add a little more black sesame. Once again, I'm sorry, would you, there's scissors here. I think that hasn't been opened, and I so appreciate your help. I told you I don't cook. I'm not good at like doing it perfect every time.
So we need to add more.
Just, yeah, okay, you could either pour a little in, or you could a little bit more, even a little bit more. Okay, let's try that. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I was talking and not paying attention. So you see how this is really sticking to me? Way too much honey. So, well, so a little bit of sangye. And you could just pour some in, but it might plop out, so be a little careful, or you could use a spoon if you want. You can be a little more aggressive. Okay, that's probably good. Thanks. There, now this is getting better. Okay. You don't have to fuss with that too much. We'll clean up afterwards. Thanks so much. So I think this is even still too sticky, but you know, I don't want to mess with it forever. So like on camera, at home I would mess with it more. But here I'm just gonna do this. So, you know, 100 times pestling, you don't really want me to count, do you? So good body mechanics, I'm moving it a little closer to me, and I'm just doing this. And every once in a while you might want to change the position. This mortar and pestle is smooth on the inside. You don't want like are they called suribachi? The Japanese thing for grinding sesame seed, because then this would all get stuck in the little grooves and not want to come out. And I'm just using a twisting motion for doing this to make it evenly dispersed, and I'm getting my upper body workout. Okay, so let's see how this is. It's too moist, it's definitely too moist, but you know, Julia Child didn't always do it right either on TV, right? Ooh, one more favor. Would you get me like a nice big sheet of, yeah, or maybe that's even a little long, but whatever. Doesn't matter. Okay, and put it here. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so now basically what I could do is just like take some, and of course my hands are just like what I told you shouldn't be, although this is better now. So I know it looks a little gross in this state, but you break off a little piece and you just, you know, roll it into a ball, and you can decide how fussy you are. Like, I'm not fussy about the form, but some people like to make every pill perfect, and you know, you could weigh them if you were really OCD about it, but you know, that's about it. I have one more thing that I've noticed, which is that if you eat it today, the texture is not exactly the way it'll be tomorrow. It seems like it sets overnight somehow. And so today, this will be kind of chewy and a little bit like in your teeth, and you might have to drink something to, you know, rinse it out. But like tomorrow, it seems like they're much less chewy, that the texture is better and it doesn't stick in your teeth. So this is the kind of thing, you know, if you have friends over and you want to make pills, you can all sit around talking and gossiping and rolling pills. But this is basically all it is. And, you know, they're not very even. I'm a messy person. Some are bigger and some are smaller. But it's a really gentle formula, so it's not like you really have to worry about overdoing it. And so this is the way honey pills are made. Some pills are a lot more complicated with a lot more ingredients, but it's the same method. You just mix the powder with honey, you roll pills, and you know. So you can see it's not perfect, but it's better. Like, my hands are sticky from the earlier mistake, but the palms where I've been rolling, it's not like that one picture that was way too moist. So these are probably okay. And it really felt very dry before I started pestling, but as soon as I started working it, you could tell. So this is the first aspect of making pills. I think I need to wash my hands. Okay. It's a little early, but I think I need to wash my hands.
Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break now and return at 10 o'clock.